Today I want to talk a little bit about the batch, adjustable batch, match, and separate modules, which can be used to do a whole bunch of really interesting things with your simulations, including how to set up a Kanban setup, even a multi-Kanban setup with multiple machines. Before we talk about that, let's go ahead and talk about what each of these modules do. So as I get started, I'm of course coming into this with the understanding you know what a process module is, create module, all that stuff. If not, there is a tutorial available here, a playlist that this is in. Check out the channel to see more about that. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So the basic idea behind an entity, I think I will go over the separate one first. The separate one actually has two different sort of functions. And the first one is going to be that you can take incoming entities and you can duplicate them. The idea for this and the example I want to show is an airport security line. Maybe you have a bag process as well as a process for the passengers. They come in as one entity and they need to be split into two, and then those two go through further and end up doing different things. They go through different processes, but they need to be paired up back together a little bit later. So let's start with our create module, and we're just going to use a basic create module. We're just going to have one entity type for now, and we're just going to call this entity 1. We're going to have an inter-arrival time of maybe 3 minutes. Seems pretty reasonable as an exponential time. Treat it a little bit as a plus on process. So the first thing these things are going to do is come into the separate module. Now the separate, we don't want to split an existing batch because we haven't made that yet. What we want to do instead is to duplicate the original. Now once you do this, there's a few things that you can do. You can have multiple duplicates. You could have maybe a line for the bag, a line for the person's shoes that they have to take off to go through airport security, and one for the person. We're just going to leave it as is, and I'm not really worried about tracking time spent per entity and stuff like that. If you were, you could look at the percent cost to duplicates right here. So you can see that if you set 0, it's going to have none of the incoming cost will get set to the duplicates, or if you put 100%, it will move all of that there. That's important if you're tracking different entity types, what happens to a lot of that stuff, but won't be relevant for this simulation or this example here, especially because there's nothing actually going on before this. Okay, we have our incoming separate module, and now we're going to have two separate processes. We're going to have process 1 will be the checkout process for the people going through the line, and process 2 is going to be the line of bags and such that goes through the bag process. So I'm just going to name this bag process, and we're going to have this one take a resource. It's going to be resource 1. I can name it TSA agent, whatever you really like. We're going to give it a time of minutes. Maybe this is normal, value of 2 minutes, standard deviation of 0.2, 1/10 seems reasonable. We're going to call this the person process because I have creative names, and this is going to be cease, delay, release. Again, we're going to use that same resource, just one of them, and now we're going to put this with a uniform time of, let's just say, 0.5 to 1.5 minutes seems roughly reasonable. Okay, so now that each of these things are going through these separate processes, we're going to go into data definition, select resources, and make sure that there is capacity of 2. So we do want to make sure that there's 2. The one person could be doing both. Both people could be helping out the bag process if we like. Some of them will go a little bit slower or faster than others. Now, interestingly, we actually need to group things back up again. So let's go ahead and put in a match module. We could do the same thing with a batch module too. The batch module here, if we open it up, is going to group entities together. Now, right now, if I put this through here, it's possible that everyone's luggage might not get matched up with everyone else's. And for that reason, we're going to need to make sure we batch on an attribute. And we could use a match module here as well if we like. So we'll just want to, I'll show you that one as well. Okay, so we're trying to batch on an attribute, which means that we need to talk about attributes. I have a previous video on this one. If you don't, it should be okay if you don't have that or haven't watched it. It's fairly straightforward. All I'm going to do here is add an attribute, and we're going to call it we can just call it entity number. Entity by number here would work pretty well. And, well, let's just see, active entity. We're going to call this, number. Or ID number might be a better option here. And we can go through build expression, and you want something that's going to be unique, so everything is going to be matched up okay. So if we do number in, the number in for entity 1 should increase by 1 every single time. You could do some other stuff like write ID1, I could do ID plus, ID concatenate, a bunch of other stuff to do here, but entity number in should work pretty well here because I'm just running one simulation. I don't have things moving around other than that. Okay, and I'm not going to mess around with rows or columns because we just want to store it in that one value. We don't need to necessarily build a matrix to store different things in. So there's the assign, I'm going to call this assign ID, which means now our ID number, which is ID underscore number, when we actually go into our batch module, we're going to want to make sure that we group this by attribute, and the attribute is going to specifically be ID number. Okay, there we go. And the batch is going to be permanent. There's two options, permanent and temporary. You can do temporary only if you're going to split these up later with another separate module, which we'll show that in a little bit here. We have our batch process, the things come back together, that's great. And then we're going to get a dispose module and run this so you can see a little bit of how this works before we start to make it more complicated and before I show you the Kanban example. So if I run this here, you can see that it's going pretty fast for one. You have, something goes through the separate, and something comes into the separate module, and then it goes out of both at the same time, goes through the process for each one of these, and is later batched up. So if I actually pause this a little bit after some of this stuff is out here, you can see the entity 60 here has a user-defined attribute ID number of 57, which means that there should be something that comes through. Actually, the one that it just got paired with should match up with that attribute. So right now, there is something, entity number 56, with a user-defined attribute of 57, is again going to be waiting for some next thing to come through. So this next one here, entity number 59, has an ID number of 60, which means that these two cannot match up to each other. They just need to have the same ID number to do that. Now, as soon as other stuff comes along that matches, things can move forward. That's fantastic. What the batch module would specifically allow you to do would be to batch up things that are the same entity type. If you want to define something that's a different entity type, for instance, a match module might be more appropriate. If I go into my grouping function and I find match and put that here, I'm going to want to match up entities based on an attribute. That attribute name is going to be ID number, and you have the option to just match them and let them go keep doing other things. So if you want to send them through a secondary screening everybody through that one, I could do no batch, and I could just have two different outputs. Connector 1 would go with that top one, go to some process. Connector 2 could go with the second one. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to do a permanent batch, which should look pretty familiar. And you can you can choose which entity or how you're treating the entity defined attributes. If we're batching on the ID number attribute, it doesn't really matter. You can pick first entity, last entity. You don't want to do something like the product or the sum, especially of those user-defined attributes like ID numbers, because those don't make a lot of sense. You can also choose up to 5 entities to match. So maybe you split your existing one into 4 duplicates, which would give you up to 5 things which would all have to match on the same attribute. You can do that one as well. Now I will note here that the difference with the match module and batch is the number of incoming queues. So the bag process is going to go to one of them. I could actually switch them and put the top one to the top one. The bag process will go to the bottom one. The person process will go to the top one, which is going to make sure it matches up one bag with one person. Now I haven't really defined how that works so far, but that can be one significant difference between the match and the batch modules. That should work pretty similar. The reports come in, and these two are going to get matched up with each other. Occasionally, you're going to see a queue start to form in this match module. You can actually refer to that, and what this is doing is it's waiting for that same ID number to show up. You could also do something like instead of having a person and a bag process, you could have multiple create modules where you have a create module here. And that, let's see, we don't even necessarily need to assign an ID to this one. So we could have a create module 1, create module 2. We're going to create something, entity type 1, arriving every 3 minutes. This one's going to be entity type 2, and we'll put every 3 minutes here as well. But we might give this one a exponential, seems fine there. And now we can put both of these going through, and we just need to make sure we change the entity type from 1 to 2 on the second one. Now what we can do here, I guess we should keep our attribute assignment there. Actually, we don't even need an attribute. We can batch just based on any entity type. So now any entities that show up that in that second one will get matched with the first one. So a few things show up, now top person shows up, and we're eventually going to start to see some sort of queue. So right now there's entity type 1. I suppose I should actually give you some different pictures for this. So if entity 1 is, if I go into my data definition, I can change that and give entity 1, let's make them a box, and entity 2 is going to be a person. Now we're going to make sure we're matching up one box with each person, although it doesn't matter if there's any ID numbers or anything like that so far. I guess our separate is making things more complicated, so we should actually just remove that. That doesn't make any sense to have in this case. So now we just have a bag process, person process, etc. We can even just feed those through the same one. At this point, this isn't necessarily an airport terminal anymore. I guess we do need those to be separate. This matches up just whatever is in the top with whatever is in the bottom. So this box right here is going to be matched up with this person because they're flowing into different things. And it's just anything in the top one is matched with anything in the bottom is how this currently works. And you can see them waiting in queue. I guess that's kind of fun. So regardless of what entities there in the top, what entities in the bottom, it will match those up here. If we wanted to, we could also define and make sure it matches by attribute rather than any entities with the match module. Okay, well, we talked a little bit about the separate module, how we can use it to split things and make copies. You can also use that later on if you like. It can get a little more complicated with, let's say, an adjustable batch, which is the next thing I want to show you. So let's say we just have a grinding process where we have incoming raw material parts, we want to grind them up and then output them. That seems okay, and what you might want to do is only grind things that come in batches. And for that, I'm going to put an adjustable batch, because the default batch that you would have would just make sure that you always have to group up batch size of, let's say, 4 entities. That's okay if that's all you want to do. You can just batch them up, process them, and call that good. But what you could do if you really wanted is an adjustable batch, which meant that you're trying to have a preferred batch size of 4, and we'll make this one a permanent one. But if it's been 30 minutes, you're just going to send them on regardless. And maybe we'll do, let's see, interarrival time was 3 minutes. Let's go ahead and say maximum wait time will be 9 minutes. If it's been 9 minutes, we can do a batch size of fewer than 4 and just send them on anyway. That's the advantage of having an adjustable batch. So that can work out pretty well. So now we have a bunch of boxes arriving, 3, 4 of them arrive, it gets sent on. 1, 2, 3 arrive, it gets sent on because it had been 30 minutes there, or 9 minutes, and had continued on. So that's something that you might find useful with the adjustable batch feature. Now, I do want to talk about a few other things with this batching, especially if you're trying to look at the results of your statistics. At the very end, you want to make sure that what I would do is whenever you are combining something, I would make sure that you set it to be a representative entity type, a new name for your entity. If you have it as the old one, you're going to start counting 3 times as high as you probably should if you're batching 3 times together. So every time I batch, I just name something else, because as far as I understand it, when 2 things come into the process, it's going to turn both of those things into a new entity, especially if you have a save type of permanent on there. It's also worth noting that if you ever save something as temporary, you need to split it up later, otherwise Arena is going to give you an error. Okay, so let's go ahead. We talked about separate, adjustable batch, batch, and match. Let's talk a little bit about the Kanban example that I was talking about earlier. So the idea for this one is maybe you have raw material that's incoming. We're just going to have that be this create module right here. I'll go ahead and name this create raw material. And this is going to be incoming, fairly fast rate here. Let's do one every minute on average. And what I want to do here is feed these through a machine. But let's say that there's not a lot of room at this machine for a lot of things, and we'll give it a process time for cease delay release. Let's do triangular, seems okay, 1 minute. On average, add resource 1 if something is required. This is a process module, but we want to make sure that you're only releasing things from the sort of queue at a pretty at a controlled rate. You don't want to overwhelm this queue. You don't want it to get too big. Now you could do some stuff with the queue specifically and tell you how large you wanted it, but the other thing you could do is have some Kanban cards and just do a one card Kanban system. And what is helpful for here and what you're actually going to need to do is every time you have an incoming raw material, you want to make sure that you match it and that you match it with a Kanban card. So we're going to have incoming raw material, we're going to match it with a Kanban card, and then we're going to feed that in, and we can actually do a batching here. So permanent batch, it won't matter which attribute they are, we don't need to match it up by entity ID or anything. Match, we're going to call this K1. And once those cards are matched, once that card and that part are together, we're going to send it into process. And this is actually going to be a temporary batch because we're going to split it up later and send the cards back to the beginning. We actually need to create our cards first, and what I'm going to do with this create module, I'm just going to say create cards, and I'll give it a value of 1 second. I'll give it a max arrivals of 1, entity per arrivals of, let's say, 3. So we're going to have 3 Kanban cards available at any time throughout this process. It's a pretty high number, especially for just a single machine here with low variability, but that's going to be okay. Now I did explain more of this, how this worked in my first video on the create module, but this is going to make one group of 3 cards, and I think we're going to call this K1 cards for the entity type. Okay, so let's just actually connect this all together here and continue working on the logic for what happens at the very end and what we should do with this process when everything, process machine should be okay. What should we do at the very end when all this stuff needs to, be outputted? Well, I guess the first thing we need to do is actually split this batch apart so we can start to make decisions. So I'm going to put in a separate, and we're going to separate cards from product, because this is now your finished product. We're going to split existing batch. Now what's going to happen for this one is they're all going to keep flowing in the same layer. So we need to figure out what entity type it is. And if it is a Kanban card, for instance, we're going to feed it back into the match module, notice going into that same location. And if it's not a Kanban card, it's just going to go directly into the dispose. We're going to call that the end of the process. You could also duplicate this whole thing here and put in a second machine with its own set of Kanban cards, for instance. So this decide module, we need some logic. It's going to be a two-way by condition. If the entity type is entity 1, I think is this first one right here, entity 1, it's going to go through to the dispose. If not, it's going to go back to the initial bit. Under data definition, let's make sure our resources are set up appropriately, or our entities rather are set up appropriately. So entity 1 will be a box, and K1 cards, I guess a report is kind of like a card, so I think that works out to be okay. We're not using entity 2 anymore, so we can remove that one. And our process looks like it's set up okay. Let's actually increase the variability on this one, just to see what happens with more variability. You might need some more cards. So now if I run this one, you can see a box is coming, and we have 1 card. I think I need 3 cards total are going to come out of this. And now the box and the entity are paired up. They're in that process machine. There's a second one in there because remember we have 2 resources. And once it finishes, it's going to go through the separate module and actually get moved from the separate module through to the side. The box is going to go directly into the dispose, and the cards are going to go all the way back to the beginning. Now it is important to note that these things again are grouped together. So when it's in that process step right there, waiting for the process step, whatever, even though you're just seeing that card, again, it is actually both entities are still in there. I'm separating them. So that's where the representative entity type might come in handy. If I skip through the entire simulation and take a look at the results, once it actually finishes fast forwarding, if I have set up a maximum runtime, which looks like I haven't, let's set up a runtime maximum of one day seems reasonable. That's 24 hours, plenty of data to come through. We're going to get a lot of product output here. So if I run through this and take a look at the results, and again I have to change my port because it doesn't currently work in a Arena does not currently have that stuff working. Let's see, that should be in run reports. It's somewhere in there. Developer mode is what I'm looking for. No, it's not. Tools. I stop it from running and go into setup, into reports. There we go. I want to change it to use Notepad because that's what the word works the best. So if I start the simulation over and then run it, I can now actually see what happens with these entity types and such. So right now I can see that, and it's opening up all the other things I've ever worked on, of course. So that's an old one. So here's the one I think is accurate. The K1 cards has a value. If we look at how many actually exists of the K1 cards, for just one simulation, I didn't do multiple runs, so half width and stuff like that isn't going to work. There's somehow, 1,480 K1 cards. That doesn't make any sense because there should only be 3 of them. And that's because it's taking the 1477 of entity 1 and combining those with the 3 we actually have. Let's go ahead and make sure that we can change that. And to change that right here, when they get matched together, I'm going to say that the representative entity type, I'm going to call that rep_ent for representative entity, and that should mean that the total output is going to be much more accurate. So we'll have to take a look and see how this works. 1477 went in, 3 went in for that one, so we should see much better results here. So if I look at entity 1 number out, now it's 1475. Kanban cards out, of course, is 0, and there's 3 out right here. So we have our much better representative entity was 1475, is now the same as entity 1. So that's where representative entity type may come in useful. You can also do things like define your own counts and stuff like that if that is helpful. So I hope this video showed you how you can use match, batch, and adjustable batch as well as a host of other things. And I hope you can find some other content on here that will help you be better at Arena. That's all I've got, so I'll see you in a future video.